And so, Tanya Miller, here's the thing about this prosecution case that bugged me from the get-go. And it's a visual thing. I can visualize, whether it's true or not, what the defense said happened that night in that little area at the retreat at Twin Lakes. I had a real hard time wrapping my mind around what the prosecution said happened that night. Now, at one point, very late in the case, Bernie Della seemed to say, look, maybe they were rolling around, and maybe the reason why you see some witnesses say one was on top and the other witness says the other's on top is because they were rolling on top and they were taking turns, just like you do when you have a scuffle, you roll around. Why didn't he say that in the opening statements? Why didn't he present a picture of what he thinks happened that night?
Well, you know, I think that was a strategic decision. I have seen cases like this where the only other eyewitness besides the defendant is no longer here to tell the jury exactly what happened. And so the prosecutor has to piece together his case and his theory using circumstantial evidence. I don't know that I would have committed to a version of what happened in opening statements. But I do think strategically you do run a risk as a prosecutor by not telling the jury what happened. Even if you don't have a witness there to say exactly what happened, you really have to give them the scenario that fits the evidence. The prosecutors chose to take another route in this case. They chose to bank on the fact that this jury would hold the fact that you cannot tell exactly what happened against the defendant because he killed the only other eyewitness. That was a risk. That was strategic. And, you know, like it or not, that was their decision to make. I do think you run a risk when you don't tell the jury because they want you to tell them. You're the prosecutor. They're looking to you to tell them what this evidence means. They're looking to you to tell them the story, what happened to this victim. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And I know different prosecutors view this differently. And I think it was a strategic decision. It may have hurt them at the end of the day, but overall, I think they did a good job trying this case. I think they believed in their case. I think that came across in their closing argument. They were committed to the idea that this was second-degree murder, whether you agreed with it or not. And I think that meant a lot to some people who were watching this trial.
I don't think it's true that he doesn't feel responsibility. George was completely sorrowful after this happened, and just because he's calm or because he's not over the top, you know, emotional doesn't mean he doesn't feel terribly about it, as we saw in court when he asked Doris Singleton, "Are you Catholic?" "Yes, because in my religion it's bad, no matter what, when someone loses life."
George Zimmerman's brother speaking to Piers Morgan last night about the extraordinary events that happened here at the courthouse in Sanford, Florida. Not guilty. George Zimmerman found not guilty after 16 hours and 20 minutes of deliberation. And we do know that the family of the victim, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, will be going to church this morning. And Trayvon Martin's father, Tracy Martin, tweeted, "Even though I am brokenhearted, my faith is unshattered. I will always love my baby Trey."
So heartfelt, and Sabrina Fulton tweeting as well, really leaning on her faith. It's almost a prayer as much as it is a tweet. Here are her words: "Lord, during my darkest hour, I lean on you. You are all that I have. I will love you forever, Trayvon, in the name of Jesus." It's that kind of heartfelt prayer, and she's leaned on her faith throughout this. I want to bring back Jason Johnson, again, a professor. Jason has spent time in this community. I'm sure a lot of people in this community are going to be going to church today to lean on a faith after a verdict that so many are not happy with. Have you talked to anybody yet? I know it was late and into the early hours, Jason, but have you gauged any reaction yet, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I on Twitter and also by text, I actually communicated with a couple people down there. And I got to be honest, I mean, one couple in particular, I met a young African-American couple when I was down here, when I was down in Sanford, said they're not surprised. I mean, you got to be honest. There were a lot of people who when they saw this jury, who, when they saw 2 or 3 days of the prosecution, when they saw what they felt was the prosecution's inability to properly prep witnesses like Rachel Gentile and Dr. Bao, they thought that this was a highly likely result. And so I think there's a lot of people who are disappointed in Sanford, but they're not surprised. And that can be taken a lot of different ways.
When do we walk? Well, I think it's impossible to predict what happens in a criminal case. We sat there, Casey Anthony, everybody, a lot of the talking heads. Oh, she's going down. She's guilty. This is a slam dunk. And we were all, of course, when the verdict came down, not guilty. So I often find that legal experts can be a contrarian indicator, especially if it's sort of groupthink and one person says this is going to happen and then everybody else jumps on that bandwagon. But Janet Johnson, when you're talking about the massive amounts of information that this jury had to process, and I'll just read over, this is 12 trial days, 56 witnesses, more than 200 exhibits, 7 statements about the shooting made by George Zimmerman alone, 3 911 calls. How is it that one can take all that information and put it in a blender and really predict what people are going to do?
Well, I have to say, the defense attorney, and there were no questions asked. It is allowed in Florida for the jurors to ask questions, but it didn't happen in this trial. And as a defense attorney, cynically, I hate to say this, but sometimes when there are unanswered questions, we think that that benefits the defense. So if it was confusing, quite frankly, that could benefit the defense. And I think that there obviously was some confusion about manslaughter, at least on the part of one juror, and that is the case. But we talked earlier, Tanya was saying, they painted a sort of vaguer picture. They didn't have a sort of scenario that they were positing. This was an affirmative defense. Let's not forget, this was self-defense. So that had to be disproved beyond a reasonable doubt that it was not self-defense. And let's face it, they didn't do that. They couldn't come back and rebut that. And even last night, Angela Corey was still arguing it. We don't think that injury was serious bodily injury. Well, Mark O'Mara said in his closing, and was right, you don't need serious bodily injury. You just need to have a reasonable fear of serious bodily injury, and they're still arguing it after the jury has come back with a verdict.
In fairness to Angela Corey, she was being asked specific questions about why she charged the case the way that she did. People wanted to hear from her. People have criticized her repeatedly about taking a very aggressive stance on this killing. And so I think she was explaining to the people who were asking her questions in this press conference why she did what she did and why she viewed the evidence the way she did. So I don't think she was trying to relitigate it. I don't think that's really a fair characterization.
Well, actually, okay, Tanya, it was Mike's question.
We're going to talk about it. Hold that thought.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
No, you're right,
debate.
Janet. Yeah, I asked her, and we'll talk about it.
That isn't the question.
There certain,
right.
Was there one argument you had to win and didn't? We'll talk about it. Was it who was screaming for help? Who was on top? The severity of George Zimmerman's injuries? We'll talk about that. And, of course, we're looking ahead as the sun rises in Sanford, rising on a not guilty verdict. Stay with us.
Michael Anos with HLN.
Yes, Mike.
Piggybacking off that, was that the argument or one of the key ones you thought you had to win? Who was screaming for help? Maybe it was the severity of George Zimmerman's injuries. Did you feel you had to win those and maybe didn't?
That's another interesting point because a lot of people said, why didn't we produce the photographs of George Zimmerman's injuries, the blood on the back of his head? Well, one of the reasons is because we didn't also produce the picture of his physician's assistant who said the cut was this big. So see, when you put together a case, you have to analyze all of it, not just what was going on right at the time of the crime. So those injuries, we believe, did not rise to great bodily harm. Children across this country, athletes, get injuries like that every day and go right back into the game. Or their parents kiss them after they've fallen off their bike and they go right back in. I'm not trying to minimalize this, but we did not believe that what the statements were that were made by George Zimmerman comported with injuries of great bodily harm. And one of the other key pieces of evidence, as Christy asked earlier, was we don't believe that he could have been straddled and had the gun on that inside back holster and gotten it out if he was truly being beaten at the time the shot was fired. And so that's another key element in our decision to file charges.
And again, that was my question to Angela Corey right after the stunning verdict. And let's open it up to our panel. And Jane, I'll start with you on this one. The arguments that the prosecution needed to win but did not. What's most important? Who was screaming for help?
Well, listen to what Angela Corey said, and I think it goes to the heart of the prosecution's problem. We don't believe. We don't believe. What do you believe? I know that the prosecution does not have to present what they think happened, but it helps if you want to win the case. Take a look at Prosecutor Juan Martinez in the Jodi Arias case. He didn't say, well, she's lying and leave it at that. He said, here's what she did. She stabbed him in the chest. Then he staggers to the sink. Then she stabs him in the back. Then he staggers down the hole. Then she slits his throat. He painted an actual picture of what he believes happened. I do believe the prosecution never did that in this case. It was murky as the rainy night in which it actually happened.
Ashley Merchant, is that the problem? Not the clear narrative, or was it losing big points like screaming for help, who was screaming for help, and things like that?
I think Jane hit the nail right on the head. The jury has got to believe that the prosecution believes in their case. If the prosecution is not convinced and doesn't have all the answers, the jury's not there to fill in the blanks. That's not their job. The prosecution's job is to fill in all the blanks. And so if they do not have the answers and they do not fully believe in their theory of the case, the jury is left with nothing. And the jury is left with no other choice than to find that they didn't prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think that's what happened here. I think there were a lot of holes in the case. I think there were a lot of unanswered questions that the state was not able to answer in their presentation. And the jury said, I'm not going to fill in the blanks. That was your job. And so we think that you did not meet your standard of proof. That's what this jury is. That's what this verdict is. This verdict is not saying that we think that George Zimmerman acted correctly. This is not that we don't think that Trayvon Martin was murdered. That's not what this verdict is. This verdict is that the state did not prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, and that they did not answer all of the questions.
Get this, Jose Baez, the defense attorney for Casey Anthony, who was acquitted, as we all know, here in nearby Orlando, he has just tweeted, O'Mara is using the same reasonable doubt exhibit that we used in Casey Anthony's case, or he tweeted this at some point, obviously, in the last recently. Okay, so what's interesting about that is that I think he's referring to the thermometer to get up to beyond a reasonable doubt, and it's very high. But here's something that I think the prosecution imitated the Casey Anthony prosecutors on, which is a bad idea because the Casey Anthony prosecutors lost. Remember how they kept emphasizing Casey lied. Casey lied. Well, what did they convict Casey of? Lying. Again, this prosecution, and I'll throw it to Jason Johnson, kept talking about how George Zimmerman lied. We're going to show you a baker's dozen of lies. He wasn't charged with lying. Did they miss the big picture by focusing so much on the lies?
They missed the big picture because they never had a focus. They missed the big picture because they put Rachel Gentile on the stand and they hadn't prepped her. They missed the big picture because they put Detective Serino on the stand and he was bitter and angry because he felt that he had been railroaded into making a charge. But here's the biggest problem. We didn't hear a clear explanation for the situation until the close from John Guy. Had they said from the beginning, Trayvon Martin was walking home, a guy started following him in a car, then that same guy started following him on foot, and he was running back to his house, and then he realized, oh my God, my parents aren't home, I don't want to lead some crazy stranger back to my house, and he turned around and asked the man what was going on, and then the conflict happened. We didn't hear that story until the closing statement, that any child's greatest nightmare is being followed home by a stranger. That was one of their mistakes, and also having a jury that wasn't even close to demographically reflective of the city.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to continue. And again, that was a great point. Great point there by Jason. And John Guy's so descriptive, but you don't hear it until the bitter end, the child's greatest fear. Excellent point. Much more coming up from our panel, and we're still gauging reaction from here in Sanford, Florida. Back in a moment. Tanya Miller's with us as well. Tanya, a couple of big points there, but let's hit on Neighborhood Watch. What do you think will be the reaction to that? Do you think neighborhoods will steer clear of Neighborhood Watch after this, or do you think more will embrace it?
Absolutely not. I mean, the problem was not with the fact that George Zimmerman was a neighborhood watchman. The problem is not that we have neighbors who are looking out for each other. The problem is that George Zimmerman did more than that, right? He didn't just see and report. He got out of his car after assuming so many false things about Trayvon Martin. He followed him, he confronted him, and he killed him. That is the problem. If George Zimmerman had followed the guidelines of Neighborhood Watch, if he had only listened to the 911 operator that told him he did not need to follow this kid, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. So the problem isn't with Neighborhood Watch, the problem was with George Zimmerman.
If I can get in here, I completely agree with what Tanya said. And I think that had he just sat in the car like he was instructed to do and not gotten out of his car, none of this would have happened. But going back to your earlier point about does Neighborhood Watch, should they tell people not to profile? We're, as Americans, we're told all the time, if you see something, say something. People are instructed to go with their intuition. If something doesn't feel right, then call it in. The police say we would rather you call it in than not call it in. So we have this tension between people using their intuition to alert law enforcement and being afraid to use their intuition because they don't want to be branded as racist. So we have to resolve that somehow.
And again, just to take you inside that press conference, that was the first question. It was asked in a volatile way. The person even interrupted Angela Corey with that, why'd you overcharge? Well, the jury didn't think so. That's the kind of fire that was coming at that prosecution team.
Tanya Miller, is it a valid point or not? Could we have had a different outcome had the charges been different? For example, maybe manslaughter as a top charge and a lesser included being something beneath that.
You know, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that we would have had a different outcome. Look, would we have had a different outcome if the jury were composed of 6 African-American mothers? I mean, you know, I think that some of this is just a little bit speculative. At the end of the day, this jury heard the evidence, they heard George Zimmerman's version, and they believed it. They believed it notwithstanding all the lies that the prosecutor pointed out. And, you know, I think that that is really what is shaking so many people who are just really shocked by this verdict. I had a friend who sent me a message that said, you know, what is wrong with our system when a young black child can be convicted of his own murder? You know, I, unlike Jason, do still believe in this system. I don't think that we should give up on it. I think that this really makes the case for diversity on juries, diversity in prosecutors' offices, diversity in law enforcement, and people need to be aware of the laws that are on the books and how they might apply to them, and then take action.
I gotta say,
I have to ask a follow-up question on that, and maybe I'll throw it to Jason. Why was this jury the way it was? I mean, the prosecution, they have, there's a whole process for selecting an impartial jury that is a representation of one's peers. Why did it turn out like this with 6 women and 5 non-Hispanic whites and 4 of them with a connection to weapons, either a family member who has weapons and one used to have a concealed weapons permit?
Well, first I'm going to say, I haven't lost faith in the system. I've just been very realistic about how our legal system generally operates with the poor and with African Americans and Latinos. It wasn't changed by anything that happened in the ruling. But here's what's interesting. If you really think about the demographics of this jury, what do you have to find for a jury in a case like this? You have to find people who are disinterested or unaware of a highly racialized, nationally important case in a town of only about 50,000 people. You were going to have a hard time finding black people in Sanford who hadn't heard of this case. So I think they were really hamstrung by the kind of sort of the environment, the universe in which they could even pick their jury. A change of venue might have actually been a good suggestion for the prosecution initially, but I think that's part of why they got the jury. You probably weren't going to find a collection of 6 African-American women in this town of Sanford who weren't very much already informed about this case.
Well, that's not actually the standard. I mean, the jurors don't have to approach a case or come to a case not knowing anything about it. The question is, can you find jurors who are willing to be impartial judges of the evidence? You can't tell me that there aren't African Americans who could have been impartial judges of the evidence, just like there are white Americans. So sometimes that's just the luck of the draw, and I'm not blaming anybody for the makeup of this jury, but I think that it does say something about how different people in our society view this case and view these facts. And had there been some alternative perspectives on that jury, perhaps things would have been different.
Ashley Merchant, how much of this case was won or lost with jury selection?
Well, I think we need to focus on how a jury is selected. You don't pick who you want, you deselect.
Right.
And so it's folks that couldn't be fair and impartial, that couldn't have been good jurors, that were actually deselected for the jury, and then you end up with the 6 that you're left with. And I also think that the focus in a trial, and I think we keep forgetting this, the focus in a trial is on whether or not the state has proven that George Zimmerman is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not whether or not Trayvon Martin was murdered. It's not whether or not that was right or wrong. It's none of those. It's not whether or not the loss of a child is horrible and what happened is horrible. The focus is on whether or not the state proved the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. And so we have to keep remembering that that's what the trial is about, and that's what criminal trials and criminal justice is about.
Right, and if I were a defense attorney, I would have worked very hard to make sure that there were no black mothers on the jury. I mean, that's what, I mean, again, it's a mutual process. They're both arguing. There were 2 people on the jury that the state wanted off. I'm sure there were people on the jury that the defense wanted off.
Right. Well, and it's whenever I have a defendant, that if I had a defendant that was a black defendant, the state is usually the one that's working very hard to keep the jury focused a certain way.
You know what? We have to jump in on the other side of the break. Reaction from the NAACP president. Stay right there.
NAACP President Ben Jealous reacting to this verdict. We're all reacting to this verdict. Again, George Zimmerman found not guilty. I'm Michael Anos, along with my friend and colleague Jane Velez-Mitchell. We're coming to you from Sanford, Florida, and there could be more action moving forward emanating from the NAACP, Jane, as they want the Justice Department to do something about
Absolutely. And I'd like to ask Janet Johnson, how would that play out? Could that play out with the NAACP asking the Department of Justice to pursue civil rights violations against George Zimmerman?
Well, and they did this a year ago. I mean, this has been investigated a year and a half ago, and presumably they decided they weren't going forward. They would have to prove this was a hate crime and essentially say that Zimmerman decided to do this because of race, ethnicity, obviously color in this case, and I think that's going to be hard to show. I mean, you can say that we suspect it, but it certainly wasn't proven, and I don't think it's provable going forward in federal court.
Can I get in on this? She just defended George's first federal hate crime case. And it is very difficult unless George Zimmerman was using racial epithets or saying, being completely clear that it was based on race. I don't think the feds are going to touch this. Right. And it would be even harder to get a conviction even if they do.
Yeah, Esther's right. I mean, the feds only
Would it be a factor that the judge said don't use the phrase racial profiling, talk about profiling? Would that be a factor?
Well, that would be what this okay.
No, you know, I agree with Esther. I mean, I think that it's very rare for the feds to pick up a case unless it's a slam dunk. I mean, in my experience, the federal government only picks up cases if they are going to win them. Because normally, in the defense world, if the feds pick up my case, I know my client is in trouble. And so, because of the evidence that came forward at the trial in this case, I think it's unlikely. But we do need to remember that there still is a wrongful death case pending against George Zimmerman. This is not, he's not going to vanish into thin air and go into hiding. He is still being sued by the family for wrongful death. The HOA settled, but he has not settled yet. So he's still going to have to come back to court and fight and defend himself in a wrongful death with a much lower burden of proof in civil law.
Let's get back to, Tanya Miller, let's get back to a point you were making concerning the jury. I mean, did they just flat out believe George Zimmerman's version, that he was the one screaming for help, and maybe he was looking for the address, as he said? Do you think they believed all of that?
I think they did. I mean, I just frankly don't understand how they could have reached this verdict if they didn't. Even if they didn't believe that George Zimmerman, you know, sort of had this malicious intent, this hatred towards Trayvon Martin, they certainly knew that he pulled the trigger of a gun, pushed up against his chest, and put a bullet through his heart. He was responsible for his death. And so knowing those facts and still rejecting that theory, manslaughter I'm talking about right now, and acquitting him tells me that notwithstanding all the inconsistencies, there was something about that narrative that George Zimmerman told that they believed.
Well, I mean, Esther Panich, he had the obvious advantage. Tragically, the only other person who was there that night was dead, the victim. And so what we were hearing was he said, but we're only hearing one side of the story, essentially, because it was a dark, rainy night. The witnesses saw little bits and pieces of an event. There was no eyewitness from beginning to end. There was no eyewitness of the gunshot itself. And ironically, do you think, Esther, that the reenactment video that George Zimmerman did with the police right after walking it through, the fact that the jurors were not allowed to go to the crime scene to see it themselves, the fact that he was able to tell his story, essentially testifying without being cross-examined with all these videotaped and audio-taped police interrogations?
I thought it helped the defense tremendously. He made multiple statements, which were all consistent, and then the defense added to that by using that animation, which was very helpful to the defense as well, because it told the story that some of us are criticizing the state for not doing. But just to go back to what Tanya and you were just talking about, I don't think that the jury had to believe George Zimmerman's voice, just that they had doubt whether whose voice it was.
Very interesting, and you talk about weaving it all together, Jane. What about the animation to close out the case, showing this is the way it could have been? How powerful could that have been for that jury as they deliberated? Again, George Zimmerman, not guilty. The reaction from the Reverend Jesse Jackson coming up. Stay with us.
Okay, Tanya Miller, what was on your mind when you heard the verdict?
I was disappointed, Ryan. Unfortunately, this verdict reinforced so many criticisms that members of the African-American community and different minority communities have of our criminal justice system. Many people viewed this as Trayvon Martin, in essence, being convicted of his own murder. So while I wasn't surprised, because I'm a prosecutor, a former prosecutor, and I've seen this kind of thing before, I was a little disappointed in light of the evidence.
You know, if we talk about Angela Corey right there, she got a lot of questions last night about whether she overcharged. Did those allegations fit the bill? Let's bring in our panel again. And, you know, before we get to that, and we're going to talk about that this morning, I want to talk about Mary's point with Tanya Miller. Because Tanya, Mary, one of our callers, just called in and said, you know what, if you don't like the laws, vote. Vote your officers out. Get change going. Do you think that will happen as a result of this verdict? Not only in Sanford, but maybe around the country?
You know, I don't know. I certainly hope so. I certainly hope that if people are energized by this verdict, if people are not satisfied with these laws, if people don't like the representation that they have in that regard, that they would civically protest by using their voice at the ballot box. I just want to make one point, because I've heard people say that, you know, this really is a legal issue, and legally George Zimmerman was not guilty. It doesn't mean he wasn't morally guilty of killing Trayvon Martin. I think that for people who aren't lawyers, there's just a disconnect there. People expect that laws in application and on the books will reflect our moral values, and at the end of the day, folks just do not understand how this child was killed when he was on his way home, armed with nothing but iced tea and Skittles. That's the thing that regular people just don't understand.
Yeah, well said. It's what a lot of people are saying today, exactly what you just explained.